Welcome to probably every man's most favorite subject, sex.
Well, and women's.
Fair point. Women's too. The reality is that sex is such an important part of a marriage, but everyone's experience and feelings around sex, there's a broad range. So you might be sitting there being very excited. You might be sitting there coming from a different angle of feeling scared or anxious or worried. Wherever you are as it relates to sex, we want to put your mind at ease, and we're going to unpack with you, what does the Bible say about sex? The reality is sex is an amazing gift that's designed by God, especially for you and your spouse. And the neat thing about it is it was created to build intimacy with one another, and it's unique to you two. And so we're not going to go into all of the deep how-tos that exceeds kind of what we have in this course, but we do have a great book recommended in the course. Please check it out. It's great, whether this is going to be your first time having sex in your marriage, whether you have a sexual history or anything. It's a great book that will help put your mind at ease and give you practical tools and techniques.
So John, why do you think that sex is men's favorite topic?
Well, God wired men this way. God made us horny, you could say. The Bible says, be fruitful and multiply. That's not a design flaw, and that's an important thing for men and women to realize. And so what we do with that horniness, that is where things can go sideways with men, and we need to manage that. We need to be in communion with God, and we need to understand what God says about our sexuality. But I do think the beautiful thing too is that, in many cases, men and women, husband and wife, we have different sex drives. I might want to have more sex than Pam or whatever the situation is, but that is still a beautiful thing. And here's why. We have to work out this supply chain issue in our marriage, right? We have to figure out how do I ask and share what my needs are? How do you respond?
Receive it.
Yeah, how do you receive? I mean, what would you say to women, to future wives? What are some tips for women on how to deal with that, the differing sex drives?
Well, I think, depending on the woman, obviously, that really boils down to communication. I think if we feel secure enough to be able to receive the information that you're giving us, whether it's lack of sex or you want to try something new, or, I may have had a traumatic experience in my life that makes me feel triggered by the frequency or whatever the sexual issue is. But I think if women feel secure enough to be able to accept and receive information, as well as tell you guys what we want as far as what feels good or what we don't like or what things are off limits, I think that's some things that would be important for women.
Yeah, that's really, really a great point. And we're going to elaborate a little bit more on communication here in a minute. So Pamela, how do you think most women view sex?
Well, I think it depends on the stage of the relationship that they're in. I think that if you're newly engaged or you're recently married, that you may have some fears concerning sex. You may be a little bit anxious or have some anxiety about it. But don't worry, we're here to eliminate those fears for you.
That's great. But is sex just for men? Are only men supposed to enjoy sex? Because I think that's sometimes the feeling you get when you talk to couples that have not had good marriages.
No, of course not. We're supposed to have a very fulfilling sex life. That's what God has planned for us, is for us to have a joint relationship and a wonderful sex life.
Okay. So if you had four, let's just say four, I make up a number randomly, 4 tips to give women or men about women's perspective on sex, what would those be?
Well, I think the first thing is that marriage is a safe place to fumble around and kind of get your bearings when it comes to sex. We are all in a safe place when we're married because we are with each other. So you can grow from the very beginning and get better and better with time. Once we know that marriage is a safe and secure place, it ultimately builds intimacy, which is the whole point of sex.
Yeah, I love that. That's so good. So what's number 2?
So number 2 would be sexual desires related to frequency. Now, this is kind of a controversial subject, but God actually calls women to satisfy their husbands, which sounds a little bit harsh or, like I said, controversial, but we're going to deep dive into that in the content. So don't worry, women. This is not what it sounds like exactly.
Yeah, and so we're gonna get into a lot of what the Bible says about, sex and our responsibilities to each other sexually, because it is a two-way street. And what we also want you to recognize is the importance of sex. And it's not different than any of the other qualities we've covered: love and respect and submission and sacrifice. These things all work together. And if we are weak in any of those areas, there can be consequences. And sex is really definitely not an exception. If we aren't addressing the sexual needs in our marriage, we put our marriage at risk. And so we're going to help you understand that and help you with some practical tools to protect your sex life in your marriage.
So I can add to that. One thing I learned recently, I guess it was the way it was phrased, was that sex for men is like food. It's like air and water and food. And I had no idea the importance of that. And I just thought that was such a powerful way to explain how significant the actual physical act of sex was. Did you know that?
Yeah, I can vouch for that. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but that is a great point. And because it's not personal, it's not meant to make women feel wrong if they don't have the same, frequency desire. But understanding each other is a lifelong journey. And this is one element of our marriage, sex life. So what would number 4 be?
I think that number 4 would be that if you're really looking at the physicality of sex, when you're comparing that with what a woman would value as food and water, it would be being cherished. And that is so much part of the way that we can actually express ourselves in a physical way. When women feel cherished, it's so much easier to express in a physical way a sexual nature with our husbands. So they go hand in hand.
So true. Men, can't say this enough. Cherish and love your wife. You need to figure out how to make that happen. No woman is exactly the same. And that's your lifelong mission. How do I make Pamela feel loved and cherished? I work on it all the time. I make mistakes, but we talk about it and I try and get better. But when those two things are working, it's an engine firing and great things happen in your sex life, which is phenomenal. So when we talk about sex and the needs of men and women, how they're different, I'll share a personal story. Because Pamela and I we just get along pretty well. We joke around about having the same brain. But sex has been actually a subject of I think 3 fights we've had in our whole life. No, but it has been an issue. And that part of that was because of my family of origin issues and some of my history in my first marriage, where I had a real problem and I wrestled with sharing my needs, frankly, what were my needs in general. So to me, it was safer to control my own needs. No one could let me down. And that happened with me with my sex needs. So when I first started talking about that with Pamela, I was very nervous and I was very anxious. And when I did it, some of your own baggage came out.
Yeah.
Where, her past, where she felt, how did you feel? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Oh, no. I just didn't feel cherished, I think. And that's why I was very in reserve, I would say, or withdrawn in my explaining and giving and receiving your needs and my needs.
Yeah. And you had shared that you kind of felt used. Mm-hmm. So when I shared my sexual needs, the feeling from you because of your past was that I only cared about you because of what you provided me sexually, mm-hmm. even though I hope you'd agree, my actions towards you conveyed that I loved you far beyond that.
Yes.
Right? And so that's an important thing for us all to understand, is that our history, our sexual history, our family history, all of these things add complexity to our sex lives. And communication is such a critical part to understanding one another, understanding where we're coming from, because sex is God's, a very critical ingredient, designed by God to create and maintain intimacy in our lives. And so when you look at, I'm sure many couples that range from having great marriages to bad marriages, but it's a very common occurrence when you see a marriage that's struggling, or you hear, a husband or wife who vents and, complains about their husband. At the core, there are some sexual issues going on. And that's why we want to emphasize the importance of investing and understanding and working, on your sex life. And it's not a one and done thing like all of the topics we cover in this course. This is something you'll work on and it'll get better and it'll get easier. All of these things get easier when you follow what the Bible has to say and you walk along this path.
So what are some misconceptions or tips that you would want to share that men have?
Yeah, well, there's a lot. because we sometimes start off without all the information. One that I think actually a lot of women, we both learned this and we were shocked and fact checked each other, and was that, when you ask men and women, what is a man's primary objective when they have sex? It's actually not to just have sex. That would be like to get off. Or
That was a shocker.
That was a shocker, right? No, the primary objective for a man when he has sex with a woman is actually to please the woman.
Yeah.
So I'm going to pause, let you think about that for a second, because what it does, if you're a man, think about that. Where do you feel the greatest after you've had a sexual experience is when you have pleased a woman. The beauty of understanding that concept is that as a woman, it reframes your perception of that sexual interaction in your marriage, because now you realize that the reason you're having sex together is because he wants to please you. Yeah. Right?
That was a big surprise to me at 48 years old.
Same for me. When I read it, I thought, well, I paused and then I thought about it. I'm like, yeah, that's absolutely right. So that's a really, really important and powerful thing to understand for men and women. The other is that how do you please a woman? How do you please your wife when you're having sex with her? You'll spend time figuring that out. And what the problem the biggest mistake most men make is they think that it's a singular formula. And that once I learn the magic formula, like a video game, I can just hit the same buttons and the same thing's going to happen. And God did not make women that way. That's the truth of the matter. And so that could be a frustrating thing if you think you've figured out the secret formula. But it's a beautiful thing when you realize that's not how it works, because our job is to try and understand and uncover the mystery of woman for the rest of our lives. So treat it as a game, guys.
Yeah.
And communicate. This is another nice thing about that, is it does force us to communicate with each other. This means that I need to ask, does that feel good? And you need to say that does not feel good. And we communicate and we figure those things out. And Pam's able to ask me to do something differently or to stop doing something. And I can ask, what do you want me to do? And these
Just
are all
about the communication.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. All right. This is another very common one, and it's simple, it's easy, but when does sex begin?
In the morning.
Yes, it does begin in the morning. A lot of men, we think sex begins when I decide I want to have sex, in the 30 seconds before you're hoping that happens. But the reality is, going back to the love and this cherished concept that women need to feel loved and cherished, is we need to demonstrate that in the morning, or, before you're hoping to have sex with your wife, right? So we want
as much before as possible.
Yeah. For us, practically, what that looks like, and I do it every day, whether or not sex is part of the agenda, but it's coffee. Like, we hug and we have just a positive interaction in the morning, because I genuinely love and cherish Pamela and I want her to know that. So sex is this unintentional byproduct that comes as a result of, you feeling that way. Would that be a good way to say it?
I mean, foreplay is one thing, but foreplay is a lot bigger than that. It can be the Post-it note or the spicy text that you get in the afternoon, or it can be so many different things.
Yeah. Yep. And that's fun to explore those different elements in your sexual relationship with your spouse. The other classic male problem is hygiene. So it's not as important to many men than it is for women. Gentlemen, take a shower, smell good, look good for your wife. That's not everyone's that way. We don't want to put, a box around everyone, but it's a very common mistake, is men coming home not smelling good and trying to snuggle up to the wife and say, let's be intimate. And so that's a simple one.
You get it.
All right. Two final ones. One is the warm up for sex. So men, it's sub-second in many cases, especially when you're younger. It takes no time. It could be a strong breeze and we're in the mood. Women, it's not the same. Most women, again, we're not putting a box around everyone. Everyone is uniquely made. But in general, women, when you do the research and you study it and you experience it, it's really closer to 20 minutes.
Yeah.
So now 20 minutes means the 20 minutes it could be giving your wife a massage. It can be just connecting emotionally and physically. It could be cuddling. It could be chatting. Whatever that's going to be unique for you and your wife to figure out. But you want to think in terms of that longer warm-up period, because going back to the first point, our primary, where we derive the most satisfaction, is pleasing our wives. So we have to understand their time window. And so that's a good one to think about, practice. And it's fun. It's a fun thing to practice, I think.
You never complained.
You can, yeah, exactly. The last one is after sex. If you have sex with your wife and then you're out and you're checking the scores or you're texting your friends or
Falling asleep.
Well, the falling asleep, we'll agree to disagree. We'll talk about that.
Okay.
But the other ones, that's not like spend time with your wife after cuddling, talking to her. Don't make her feel like you had your sexual needs met and now she's not important or not relevant. The falling asleep thing.
Yeah, let's talk about the falling asleep thing.
We'll talk about, and it's actually an important thing for women to understand. The falling asleep thing is legitimately, scientifically, a chemical reaction in the man's brain after ejaculating.
So we can't be upset if you fall asleep after. We should be like, yes,
This
did a good
goes-
job.
I mean, you don't need to celebrate the fact that we fall asleep, but in a way you should. Look how satisfied we
Like
are.
we did it.
Yeah, this goes back. So no, that's actually an important one to understand. But those are my top, tips
Okay.
for the men.
Helpful. So we know sex is important. We've got some practical tips and tools, but how do we protect our sex life?
Yeah, it's important. It's an important question, and to help you start thinking about that. And again, we'll have this in exercise around hedges that we get into. But our thought life, and this is probably a greater struggle for men than it is for women in general. But our thought life, pornography is, it's around every corner, and we talk about this a bit in the course. It's 70-80% of people have looked at porn. I've wrestled with porn. This is not judgment if you've looked at pornography, but we also need to recognize that it is not good. Pornography, it affects the spiritual side of things. God calls us to be pure and have purity in our marriage. It affects the physical side of us. It literally creates grooves in your brain from the dopamine and stuff, and it basically can result in erectile dysfunction. And I don't want to say the most important because they're all important, but for your wife, pornography, tragically can affect self-esteem and feeling less than or inadequate, and we never want that in our marriage. So the main point I want to make around protecting your sex life is guarding your heart and your mind. We just have to be careful in this world. Behind every link we get, every email, every social media, there's something that will kind of slowly steer you as a lamb to the slaughter towards pornography, and so we just have to guard our hearts. Now, again, no judgment, but if you have wrestled with pornography, we recommend you find a Christian brother, someone you can walk with through that journey, that you can have accountability, that you can put together a strategy on what you're going to do to eliminate that from your life. So as we'll cover in the session, the Bible says everything between a man and a woman in a bedroom is kind of pure and blessed. We want you to remember that part of that is we operate in love and respect and humility. The purpose is intimacy. So we all need to be on board with those types of things. This isn't a license to go sideways. But we'll wrap this up. We have a great exercise for you to talk through, what your sexual history is, what your sexual expectations are, just to start that communication occurring, before you're married and before you begin the sexual journey. Depending on your sexual history and your background, approach this in a way that you both feel comfortable with. This isn't a pressure. Don't feel like you have to answer every single question. We don't want anyone to feel shame or pressured. At the same time, we do want to ask you to try and stretch yourself. So if if you're a virgin, which is great, we celebrate that, and these things make you nervous, try and stretch yourself a little bit with your spouse to talk about things and just begin that, because it is a
process.
Yeah, it's a process. It can feel scary when you first start talking about sexual things if you've been waiting this long, for your spouse. So look forward to you going through the session and these exercises, and we'll see you at the next session.